Hearing of the Senate Budget Committee will come to order. I'm pleased that we are joined by Director Swagel today to discuss the federal government's fiscal trajectory. My Republican colleagues complain that I and my Democratic colleagues are unconcerned about our nation's fiscal situation because they can't acknowledge the well-documented fiscal dangers of climate havoc, and they won't fix our corrupted tax system to require billionaires and mega corporations to pay fair taxes. We can at least talk about healthcare delivery system reform as a remedy for our fiscal trajectory. 1 out of 3 ain't bad. As we've noted at prior hearings, more than $10 trillion, about 35% of our national debt, stems from 2 economic shocks to the economy: the 2008 financial crisis and the COVID pandemic. As we've heard over and over again at our hearings, the economic shocks from climate change may well be worse. I suspect that Director Swagel would be the first to agree that his 10-year baseline projections are shot if we experience another massive shock to the economy. Ignoring looming systemic economic shocks to the economy would be imprudent, even dangerous. Prior to the 2008 financial crisis, the committee held no hearings on brewing trouble in the mortgage markets, nor did this committee hold a single hearing on the economic risk from global pandemics. If this committee or any committee had warned effectively of those looming shocks and Congress had then acted to better regulate mortgage markets, to invest in vaccine development and pandemic preparedness, lives would have been saved and trillions in economic harm avoided. In the first hearing we held under my chairmanship, I spoke about science as the headlights for humanity. A well-run committee can shine the headlights of knowledge, including knowledge about climate havoc, into the future to head off dangers lurking there. Our national debt is not only the result of those 2 economic shocks, of course. It is also the result of repeated rounds of Republican tax cuts that primarily benefited giant corporations and very, very wealthy individuals. The Bush and Trump tax cuts, skewed to the wealthy and big corporations, have added another $10 trillion to the national debt. If not for those tax cuts, the debt-to-GDP ratio, our best fiscal safety metric, would be declining in perpetuity. Helping the wealthy avoid taxes is such an infatuation that House Republicans even brought the United States to the brink of default, trying to prevent the IRS from cracking down on wealthy tax cheats. The third great driver of our fiscal perils is an aging population. As our population ages, we spend more on Social Security and Medicare. Add in the developed world's most inefficient health care, and you've got a huge fiscal cost. CBO has found that reforming how we pay for health care and increasing participation in accountable care organizations and other value-based care enterprises can save money without cutting benefits. Indeed, CBO found that actual and projected federal health spending over the 2010 to 2033 period was $6.3 trillion lower than predicted, which I attribute to improving quality and moving to value-based care. I am pleased to be working with Ranking Member Grassley and other Republicans on delivery system reform proposals to do more of that. Democrats have always pledged to protect and preserve Social Security and Medicare. For years, Republicans sought to cut both programs. Now they say they don't. If so, that is wonderful news, and I applaud it. If we all agree that we're not cutting Social Security and Medicare, and we all agree that their trust funds become cash insolvent in approximately 10 years, there's only one solution left: raise new revenues to fund Social Security and Medicare. We can do this by decorrupting the tax code so that big corporations and billionaires don't pay less in taxes than nurses and firefighters. My Medicare and Social Security Fair Share Act will protect Social Security and Medicare forever, or at least for as far as actuarial science can see. Imagine if American families could erase from their list of worries, what if Social Security and Medicare won't be there for me? What a blessing that would be. For 18 months, we've heard a steady chorus of Republican voices expressing alarm about debt and deficits and calling for this committee to focus on its real job. It's hard to reconcile that with Republicans voting for the 2017 reconciliation bill that cut taxes for the wealthy and large corporations and blew a $2 trillion hole in the deficit. It is hard to reconcile that with Republican plans to extend those cuts and add almost $5 trillion more to the deficit. And it's hard to reconcile that with Republican calls to spend an extra $6 trillion on defense with no proposed offset. And what is the Republican plan for the looming insolvencies of the Social Security and Medicare trust funds? MAGA Republicans live in a fantasy world of a balanced budget with extended Trump tax cuts and funded Social Security, Medicare, defense, and veterans programs. Can't happen. CBO says it's arithmetically impossible, even if Republicans cut everything else to zero in the entire budget. To get real about debt and deficits, we have to avert climate-driven shocks and persistent climateflation. We have to decorrupt the tax code so that big corporations and billionaires are no longer a favored, free-riding elite. And we have to bring down healthcare costs without cutting benefits with common-sense delivery system reforms, which is why I focus on those things. Senator Grassley.
Before I read my statement, I want to comment on what you said about Social Security and Medicare, and I'm not criticizing what you said. I'm going back to this comes up. Why come you guys can't do something about saving Social Security and Medicare? And I use history as an example. I always start out by saying, you know why nothing gets done in Washington, D.C. about Medicare and Social Security now? There's no Reagans and Tip O'Neills in this town anymore because they found where we're going to be in 10 years on these two programs. They were right there in 1983 or 84 or whenever it was. And they raised taxes, they cut benefits, they changed formulas, and probably did a whole lot of other things that I don't remember. And they probably thought they were doing something for 20 years, I tell my constituents. But they did something for 50 years now if we still go till 2033. And they did it because they got together and said, you know, these programs are so, I guess then they were only talking about Social Security. Social Security was so important, we can't let it go broke. And they built up a surplus that we're still using of trillions and trillions of dollars, and that's going to be spent down by 2033. And if we don't do something, Social Security is going to be cut. It's going to be cut by, I guess, 23% or something. I guess I'm trying to, if there's any comment that I'm trying to make to you, it is that they didn't just raise taxes. They got together in a program that was bipartisan and probably passed the Senate 90-10, and I voted for it. Well, Mr. Chairman, I thank you for agreeing to my request for today's hearing with Director Swagel. It's been nearly 4 years since the CBO director last testified before the Senate Budget Committee on the nation's budget outlook. That's far too long for what's traditionally been a routine occurrence in the Budget Committee, particularly given the budget hole we've dug ourselves into. Federal Reserve Chairman Powell stated earlier this year that it's, quote, past time to get back to an adult conversation about elected officials, about getting the federal government back on a sustainable path, end of quotation. Today in the Budget Committee, that conversation is finally taking place. Director Swagel, thank you for coming. And I think you're going to tell each of us things that we'd rather not hear. But that's part and parcel of having what Powell called an adult conversation. So in moving beyond the partisan blame game of who's most at fault for our fiscal mess, President Biden tried to play this game at the recent presidential debate in an attempt to claim the mantle of fiscal responsibility. The reality is that President Biden has been dragged kicking and screaming to agree to even modest spending restraints as part of last year's Fiscal Responsibility Act. The fact is, our nation's debt will soon top $35 trillion. Next year's interest payments will exceed $1 trillion. And in 10 years, Social Security will go broke if we don't take bipartisan action to save it. I shouldn't say go broke because you're still going to have the revenue coming in that'll pay 77% of what benefits are today. CBO has warned Congress for decades that we'd face a fiscal reckoning due to ballooning mandatory spending. That reckoning is now at our doorstep. Absent action, rising debt will leave future generations facing higher interest rates, lower incomes, greater inflation, and the risk of full-blown fiscal crisis. Avoiding this requires a robust discussion of revenue and spending. As I've said in previous hearings, I have a record of going after genuine tax loopholes and wasteful carve-outs, and I'm open to reviewing tax subsidies. Now, a very good place to start is with those in the so-called Inflation Reduction Act, which CBO has said actually increases inflation. Ending the law's subsidies for luxury EVs and other regressive giveaways that have exploded in cost could net hundreds of billions of savings. Contrary to claims from the left, taxing the so-called rich is no silver bullet to our fiscal outlook. Even confiscating, I want to emphasize confiscating, not taxing, all income over $1 million wouldn't close our $2 trillion deficit. History proves that high tax rates fail to raise significant revenue. So I'm repeating something I said here a couple meetings ago. Taxpayers and workers and investors are smarter than we are in the United States Senate because we've had 93 marginal tax rates, then 70% marginal tax rates, 50%, 30%, back up to 40%, and you can go on and on. But regardless of the rate, we've brought in about the same amount of revenue as you can see from this chart. So we ought to stop to think that we senators are not smarter than the taxpayers. Rather than punish success, tax reform should focus on incentivizing work, savings, and investment. And that's exactly what Federal Reserve Chairman Volcker advised Congress in the 1980s at a similar time of large deficits and inflation. It was a recipe for success then and can be a recipe for success at this point. Most importantly, we must have a frank discussion about Washington's spending addiction. Whereas revenues are in line with historical levels, federal spending relative to the size of our economy is at heights previously reserved for wars and recessions, and still growing. Record spending is driving up unprecedented debt and deficits, which fuel more spending in the form of ballooning interest payments. Interest costs are rapidly becoming one of the largest line items in the federal budget. Next year, we'll see a new record as a share of gross share of our economy. No single chart can capture the size and scope of our fiscal mess, but the closest to it is a depiction of federal relative to the size, the debt relative to the size of our economy. We're on track to set a new record high by 2027, exceeding the World War II era record. While debt to GDP rate, while debt to GDP declined quickly after World War II, today our debt is infinitely projected to grow faster than the economy, and that's the definition of unsustainable. Yet President Biden continues to use his pen and phone to spend trillions, particularly on student loan bailouts. In these unprecedented fiscal times, that's the height of recklessness. We must stop digging ourselves into an ever deeper budget hole. And I think the budget agreement reached between McCarthy and Biden a year ago starts us down that track. Maybe not as aggressively as we should, but it's still a start. We must find common fiscal goals that can serve as a catalyst for that, continuing that bipartisan action. Can we agree to debt to GDP can't increase forever without consequences? Can we agree in a debt to GDP level that we mustn't cross? One last note. This week marks the 50th anniversary of the Congressional Budget Act, which created CBO and the Budget Committee. A lot has changed since 1974, from the way Congress operates to the size and scope of the federal budget. Updating the Budget Act for the fiscal 21 century is a shared goal worth continuing to work towards. So once again, thank you, Mr. Chairman, for this meeting, and welcome to you, Director Swagel.
Thank you very much, Senator Grassley. Your mention of can we agree to a debt to GDP level provokes me to remember my work with Chairman Enzi to find a safe debt to GDP level, a glide slope to get there, and guardrails to assure that we're not cheating on it. And I think that matrix still remains a smart one. Our witness today to speak about his agency's latest economic and budgetary projections is Dr. Philip Swagel, Director of the Congressional Budget Office. Prior to his appointment to lead CBO in 2019, Swagel was a member of the Council of Economic Advisors during the Bush administration and served as Assistant Secretary of the Treasury for Economic Policy from 2006 to 2009. Director Swagel, welcome. Please proceed with your statement. Your entire testimony will be made a matter of record.
Great. Thank you. Thank you, Chairman Whitehouse, Ranking Member Grassley, and members of the committee. Thank you for inviting me to testify about the budget and economic outlook. In the projections we released last month, the projected deficit grows from nearly $2 trillion this year to $2.8 trillion in 2034. Measured in relation to economic output, deficits during the coming decades are about 70% larger than their historical average over the past 50 years. We project the deficit this year to equal 7% of GDP, with deficits projected to remain over 6% into the future. Such large deficits are historically unusual outside of a war, the financial crisis, or the pandemic. Net interest costs are a large and growing contributor to the deficit. By the end of the 10-year budget window, net interest costs are roughly 1.5 times larger than either defense or non-defense discretionary spending. Also boosting deficits are two underlying trends: the aging of the population and growth in federal health care costs per beneficiary. Those trends both put upward pressure on mandatory spending. Measured in relation to economic output, federal debt held by the public rises from 99% in 2024 to 122% in 2034, and as you both said, that surpasses its historical peak. From 2024 to 2034, the 10-year budget window, the deficit is 11% larger than we projected in February, primarily because the appropriations enacted in March and April, including both the fiscal year 2024 appropriations and the $95 billion security supplemental, those get extended out in our budget projections by statute. The additional funding increases projected discretionary spending by $1.3 trillion. But of course, the actual spending in the future is up to the decisions of future Congresses. Including the added debt service, legislative changes increase deficits by $1.6 trillion through 2034, and all changes increase projected deficits by $2.1 trillion. In our projections, a larger labor force stemming from the surge of immigration that began in 2021 reduces deficits by about $900 billion over the 2024 to 2034 period. Revenues are about $1.2 trillion greater than they otherwise would be because of higher individual income and payroll taxes paid by the larger labor force. Outlays would be $278 billion greater, of which $194 billion is greater spending, mostly for benefit programs, and $84 billion is higher interest payments. We estimate that the larger labor force from the immigration surge will lead GDP to be nearly $9 trillion greater than it would otherwise be. Now, these effects of the immigration surge on the federal deficit do not include effects on discretionary spending. Those effects depend on the decisions that will be made by Congress in the future. We're working to provide additional information on the potential impacts of the immigration surge on discretionary appropriations. And the surge in immigration will also affect the budgets of state and local governments, and we are currently examining those effects, and those are not included in the budget update. Let me finish by just going back to the beginning to say that the fiscal outlook is daunting. The United States faces a budget trajectory with deficits of more than 6% of GDP into the future. Our projections suggest that changes in fiscal policy must be made to mitigate adverse consequences of high and rising debt. Let me stop there, and I'm happy to take your questions.
Thanks very much, Director. The CBO, about 2 months ago, released new estimates that project that an extension of the 2017 Trump tax cuts would add $4.6 trillion to the debt over 10 years. Is that correct?
Yes, that's correct.
And does CBO believe that the original 2017 Trump tax cuts paid for themselves? And does any CBO data support that extension of these tax cuts would pay for themselves?
No, there was a effect of the tax cuts on the economy and back to revenues, but by far it did not pay for itself, and the same would apply for the extension of the 2017 Act.
CBO's long-term budget projections back in 2012 were the last time that CBO showed debt declining as a share of GDP. Since then, Congress has cut taxes numerous times, including extending most of the Bush tax cuts and then piling on the 2017 Trump tax cuts. Is it a fact, Director Swagel, that projected primary spending, that is federal non-interest spending, is now lower than it was projected to be in 2012?
That's correct. And the interest payments have gone up, but as you said, the non-interest payments have gone down.
So let me just, to put this into context, let's take a look at this graphic here, which shows from 1994 to 2054 how revenues and spending have worked. Social Security has gone up, and is that consistent with an aging population?
That's right. That results from the aging population.
And healthcare spending has gone up even more. Does that also relate to an aging population?
Right. That's both the aging population and rapid growth in health costs.
So other mandatory spending had a huge surge right here. Can you explain what that was? Was that COVID?
That's COVID, and the spending because of the the Senate rules, the spending in the reconciliation bill. I'm sorry, the COVID spending and then the 2021 reconciliation spending was all mandatory.
Yes. And then here's defense discretionary spending. And then this is non-defense discretionary spending, which, as you can see, has been fairly constant over all of those years. This is the place where our Republican friends want to focus all of their attention related to debt and deficits. But I think, as we can see, even if you zeroed that out, we still wouldn't get out of our problems, correct?
No, that's correct, that even if discretionary spending was entirely eliminated, that wouldn't take the deficit to zero.
Great. And then, as has been pointed out, interest costs are what are going up. That's the biggest number. And is it true that tax cuts have an effect on the interest obligations of the country?
That's right. The rising interest payments, as you noted, reflect both higher interest rates and also more debt. And the tax cuts lead to less
More debt.
revenue, which mean more debt.
Yep. So what I've added here, this is what our actual revenue has looked like. If the Bush tax cuts had not been extended back in 2012, here's what our revenue would look like. We'd be darn close to operating in an effective way. So you can ascribe an enormous amount of our problem to the extension of the Bush tax cuts, according to, are these numbers correct? Can you vouch for the extension of the Bush tax cuts having that much of an effect on revenues?
You know, I'd have to look at it. I haven't, you know, from this distance, I can't see it.
Okay.
But certainly the 2012 extension of the 2001 and 2003 tax acts had an effect on revenues, as you said.
A pretty massive effect on debt and on deficits because of lost revenues, correct?
That's right. Yes.
Yep. And then one other one I wanted to show you. If you look at what's been added to the national debt, this is Trump time. 3.6 trillion was added, and that was COVID relief, so we can understand that was a little bit of an emergency. But 4.8 trillion was non-COVID added to the debt. By contrast, there's still 2.1 trillion left under Biden, but 2.2 trillion in non-COVID. So does the math add up that under Biden, the addition to the debt is less than half than under Trump?
I mean, you know, I'd have to look at the numbers, but as you said, the dollars of debt and the debt ratio went way up, especially during the pandemic, but even before that, the debt ratio went up.
Senator Grassley.
Mr. Chairman, you referred to analysis claiming to compare Trump and Biden fiscal records. I've criticized both presidents for not doing enough to control spending and deficit, but I don't put much stock in a study of Biden's fiscal records that leaves out hundreds of billions of dollars on unlawful student loan giveaways, or that stubbornly assumes Democrats' Inflation-Enhancing Reconciliation Act is going to reduce deficits despite all the evidence to the contrary. I'm glad that your party is willing to at least moving away from the delusional claim that President Biden's agenda has reduced the deficit, even if the $4.3 trillion that they're now pointing to is a serious underestimate of how much Biden has added to the deficit. Mr. Schwagel, as I said earlier, I'm willing to consider putting certain tax breaks on the chopping block if it is part of a deal to rein in spending and deficits, but taxes on the so-called wealthy alone aren't enough to dig us out of the fiscal hole that we're in. Democrat proposals is to tax the rich, either barely make a dent in the deficit, or they're designed to sneakily tax a lot more than just the rich. So my question, has CBO analyzed any legislation or determined it would put the debt on a sustainable course just by increasing taxes on those over the 1%, at the top 1%?
No, the CBO has not analyzed any legislation that would do that.
If you were to stabilize the debt solely by increasing the tax rate on incomes above 400,000, how high would the rate have to be?
You know, we haven't done the analysis of how high, but it would have to be a substantial increase on such a narrow base.
Okay. And wouldn't the tax rate required have significant behavioral effect and serious negative consequences for the economy?
Yes, a much higher tax rate like that would have macroeconomic feedbacks that would affect growth and job creation.
Recently, the Wall Street Journal published an essay discussing historical examples of fiscal mismanaging contributing to the downfall of once great powers throughout history. Historian Neil Ferguson noted how the general rule of history has been that, and I quote him, any great power that spends more on debt service than on defense will not stay great for a long time, very long time, end of quote. According to CBO, we just crossed this fiscal Rubicon. The U.S. will spend more on interest than on defense this year and every year onward. In your view, do rising debt service costs pose a threat to economic stability? And what historical lessons can you inform our current fiscal situation?
Yes, they do. And in a sense, that's the near-term fiscal risk, is the rising interest payments. That, again, it's both higher interest rates and more debt leading to those higher interest payments. And that affects all the other choices that you as policymakers want. If you want more spending on something or tax relief on something, the rising interest payments crowd that out and then have effects on the private economy, that there's less fewer resources available for the private sector, less private investment, job creation, and so on.
The Constitution gives the power of the purse to Congress, but the current administration has used rules, regulations, and other executive actions to make major policy changes with unprecedented consequences for the federal budget, and all of this without a single vote of Congress. How have executive actions changed CBO's budget projections since the agency's February 2021 baseline?
Yes, sir. So we track those, and those go into the baseline. I'll list a couple of the largest ones, the executive actions. And you mentioned student loans. That's a total of about $560 billion, so more than $500 billion in additional outlays so far. And then there's sort of more court cases and more announcements. So that's as of, say, 2 weeks ago. So that's one. The second is the Thrifty Food Plan that redefined the basket used in the SNAP program. That along with higher food prices led to about $200 to $250 billion of higher costs. There are Medicaid executive actions to streamline enrollment. That was about $164 billion. There are others. The EPA's tailpipe rule will have costs as well, in a sense that interacts with the provisions in the Inflation Reduction Act that subsidize electric vehicles. And the tailpipe rule will push consumers toward EVs. There's ACA regulations addressing the so-called family glitch, extending subsidies to DACA recipients, and more. I should mention that some of the administration's actions have reduced the deficit. They had a rule that changed the payments to Medicare Advantage plans, and that reduced the deficit. So it's a bit of both, but as you said, it's mainly on the outlay side.
Senator Murray, Distinguished Chairman of Appropriations.
Thank you, Chair Whitehouse. Really appreciate you holding this hearing. Director Swagel, good to see you again. Thank you to you and all your staff at CBO for the critical work you do for our Congress. Mr. Chairman, my dad actually ran a five and dime store. If you nodded, then you're just gave away your age. But he ran a five and dime store, and my mom worked as a bookkeeper when we were growing up. But you don't have to run a cash register or be an accountant to understand the really basic fact that when it comes to our national budget, spending is just half of the equation. There is also revenue. And I mentioned this because when our Republican colleagues talk about debt and deficits, they tend to discuss only that one side of the ledger, which is spending. So I want to focus on something that goes overlooked, or rather goes unsaid, by my Republican colleagues, because while they love to talk about reining in spending, as the chairman just talked about, which in my mind actually means the investments that we make for families and working people, I don't hear the same concern regarding the huge tax breaks that go to mostly billionaires. When we need to get one thing clear, despite all the bogeymen that Republicans like to point to driving the national debt, the reality is that the single biggest driver of our national debt since 2001 has been Republican tax cuts. The Trump and Bush tax cuts have cost our nation over $10 trillion and counting. And what do Republicans want to do if they return to power? What's at the top of the Trump economic agenda? Do they want to solve the child care crisis? Do they want to extend health care credits that are saving millions of families thousands of dollars? Of course not. They want more tax cuts for the ultra-wealthy and biggest corporations. Republicans' big economic vision is to extend their horribly one-sided Trump tax cuts. If Republicans are so concerned about the national debt, why is it that every time they get the chance, they start giving away cash and writing tax loopholes for mega corporations? So we've got to get real. There's no reason that investors on Wall Street should pay less in taxes than a firefighter in Spokane, Washington, or a nurse in Seattle, or that companies making billions in profits should pay less than mom and pop shops in Washington State. And there's every reason for us to ask the wealthiest people in our country to pay their fair share so we can make this country stronger for everyone. So for parents back in Washington State, for working families, they don't want us to invest in the richest people in the world. They want us to invest in our roads and schools and healthcare and security and ending the child care crisis, things that actually make their lives better. You have to be kind of out of touch to miss that. That is, for my colleagues to know, why Vice Chair Collins and I have both worked together to reach a bipartisan agreement to increase both defense and non-defense discretionary funding as part of our FY25 appropriations process, so we can invest in our security and in our working families and our communities, not just to throw money away at billionaires. Now, Director, I have talked at length about the hardship and pain capping non-defense discretionary spending puts on Americans. Yet Republicans only insist on those caps. They also put outsized focus on the spending as it relates to the deficit. Current NDD spending as a percentage of GDP has declined from the long-term average, and NDD spending accounts for less than a single % of the increase in spending since the start of the pandemic in 2019, which are the spending levels Republicans want us to return to. Director Swagel, beyond emergency pandemic spending, what are the significant drivers behind our country's deficit over the last decade?
Yeah, it's, I would point to three things. One is rising interest payments. Two is rising healthcare costs. And then three is rising spending on other benefit programs. Social Security is the largest of them. And so it's the aging of the population, it's healthcare cost growth, and it's interest costs.
And revenue?
And revenue is not kept up. And you could see that in the charts put up by both the chair and the ranking member, that legislative action has made it so that, rather than rising, revenue as a share of GDP has remained flat. So as spending has gone up, revenue is not kept up.
Okay, and there was one legislative change since your last projection in February that affected revenue, the IRS rescissions. According to your report, these rescissions accounted for a $32 billion reduction in projected revenue. The IRS and Treasury project six-fold returns for every dollar spent on tax informant. Yet we continue to hear from our Republican friends that we should target IRS funding as part of the increasing deficit. So last question, how does the rescinding funds provided to the IRS under the Inflation Reduction Act impact revenue and deficits?
So in our calculations, a dollar that goes to the IRS results in an additional $2 of revenue, so for a net of $1. So the rescissions on net increase the deficit.
Thank you, appreciate that.
Senator Marshall is up now. Senator Padilla has to go and preside. So I think with Senator Lujan's permission, we will reverse. So the order will be Marshall, Padilla, the next Republican, and then Senator Lujan.
Yeah, I'm
Please
happy to
proceed,
yield to
Senator Marshall.
I'm happy to yield to Senator Padilla if he needs to scoot.
Want to go ahead, Alex? Oh, don't worry. You'll be next. That's kind of you. Thank you.
Mike is on. Thank you both for your accommodation and your consideration. Thank you, Mr. Chair, for this opportunity. Mr. Director, how are you this morning?
Yeah, thank you. Very well.
Good. Thank you for being here. I'm pleased to have this opportunity to talk to you about a subject that I've been familiar with for a long, long time. And I'm speaking specifically to the dynamic of immigration and its impact on our economy. Coming from the state of California, not just the most populous state in the nation, the most diverse state in the nation, home to more immigrants than any state in the nation. And it has the largest economy of any state in the nation as well. So we know full well that immigration and the contributions of immigrants is critical to the economy and critical to the growth of the United States. And now, thanks to the hard work of the CBO, you've all crunched the numbers and now project that U.S. revenue will be $1.2 trillion higher over the next 10 years because of the impact of migrants and migrants in the workforce as we see it today. And I would imagine that given my Republican colleagues' obsession with our debt, that they would welcome the news that CBO also found that this increased immigration, migrants, and their impact on the workforce leads to lower deficits. So it seems like it's something that we ought to embrace. So would you please speak to how the CBO was able to quantify the economic benefits of immigration and what the impact would be on revenues to the federal treasury if more than 10 million undocumented immigrants, many in the workforce, were to be deported?
Yes, so we haven't analyzed the deportation, but there's a sense in which it would be the opposite of the immigration increase that you mentioned. And so we said there's about a $9 trillion increase in GDP from the immigrants coming in. They add to the labor force, they pay taxes, they fill jobs. And so deportation would in some sense reverse that there'd be a big negative hit to GDP, the labor force would shrink, and revenue would go down.
Okay, that seems pretty logical to me, so thank you for that. I know you're from the CBO, not the Department of Labor, but I also think if we look at the data that is out there, even with the level of migration we've seen in the course of the last decade, we are experiencing record sustained low levels of unemployment. And wages continue to rise. So for those concerned, those who spread the false rhetoric that, well, immigrants are taking American jobs or they're a downward force on wages, that has proven to be false. Do you have any data that would suggest otherwise?
No, that's right. That there's a sense in which the immigration surge explains how our economy continued to grow rapidly and create jobs, even when the labor market, say 2 years ago, looked to be tight. It's the immigrants adding to the labor force. These are additional jobs and additional income.
Right. So I also want to ask about a related dynamic that is a priority concern for this committee. See, Senator Braun has joined us, and he's always one of the first, if not the first, to raise concerns about the debt. We're talking about the contributions of immigrants to the workforce and to the economy, and the net benefit that there's been on revenues, debt reduction, et cetera. But we also speak in this committee regularly about the solvency of our social safety net programs, particularly Social Security and Medicare. Now, between 2010 and 2020, the U.S. saw its slowest population growth of any decade since the 1930s. And it presents a huge challenge to those social safety net programs that rely on current workers to fund the benefits for America's retirees. And we know that immigrants help sustain the programs like Social Security and Medicare, even though they don't benefit from those programs themselves. In 2022 alone, immigrants paid over $570 billion in federal, state, and local taxes. So would you please discuss the impact on the solvency of our social safety net programs if, due to potential change in our immigration policies, we would realize a significant reduction in our workforce?
Yeah, and so we looked carefully at the composition of the immigration surge, and they're very heavily skewed toward working age adults. These are immigrants have a high propensity to work, and they have a strong incentive to work on the books once they receive authorization, generally within 6 months. Many of them will face a hearing in 7 to 10 years, and working on the books will let them in some demonstrate attachment. So all of that means more revenue for Social Security, increases the financial, improves the financial situation of the Social Security system, and and that's again, it's just like the overall revenue. Some of it goes to Social Security.
Okay. Couldn't have said it better myself. Thank you very much. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you.
Thank you, Senator Marshall, for your courtesy to Senator Padilla. It is now your floor.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and welcome, Dr. Swagel. If there's one thing clear from this meeting, it's that my friends across the aisle have promised they will raise your taxes, that is their solution to everything, is to raise your taxes. Folks, we don't have a taxing problem in this government. We have a spending problem. The Trump tax cuts demonstrated that if you lower taxes, it grows the economy and increases the tax revenue. It's a rising tide, raising all boats. I think it's quite evident. No one can argue that. It's unarguable. But what's not arguable is that that these tax cuts indeed have worked in the past. Dr. Swagel, let me ask you, do you ever review your work in the past? Do you go back and look at the last 10 years and say, what percentage were we off on our scores?
We do. We go back for major legislation and analyze in terms of what we got right and what we got wrong.
For the last 10 years, what does your score sheet look like, speaking in general?
So we compare ourselves to other major forecasters, and we do pretty well. There's some things that we've...
No, you don't do well. You just missed the deficit this year by $500 billion. That's not doing well. I mean, don't you think you're off 10, 20, 30, 40% on most of the big numbers?
Right. So from February to June, the deficit went up by 27%, mainly because of actions taken by the administration. And so there's student loans, the FDIC, actions on Medicaid that, right, we're providing you with the current law
So through
information.
executive fiat, they added, 3 or 4, I guess it's about $1 trillion.
That's right, between student loans and the other pieces, there's several $100 billion of additional
Would you have
costs.
the ability to score if we did our job, if we followed the Budget Act of 1974 and all the additions where the president submitted a budget on time, if we did a meaningful bipartisan Senate budget resolution and we went back to regular order and the House did their job, if we did a real budget, would that have impact on how much money we spend? And is that something you could help generate a CBO score for?
I mean, we would certainly support the Congress in doing that. It's hard to say what the outcome would be. Of regular order would certainly be a change, but I can't tell you what the fiscal outcome
Certainly, it
would
works
be.
in the private sector to do a meaningful budget and then use that as the blueprint and not allow an administration to tack on, like you just mentioned, almost $1 trillion of unsuspected spending through executive fiat, and which is unconstitutional the way they did it. As we mentioned before, the 2024 budget deficit is going to be $2 trillion. We're going to spend $2 trillion more than we take in this year. The administration added $2.1 trillion with the American Rescue Plan, another $800 billion with the Inflation Stimulation Act. People call it the Inflation Reduction Act. It's actually inflationary, as well as over another trillion unilaterally, as you mentioned, through executive actions. The student loans, $400 billion. They redefined the Thrifty Plan, another $300 billion. And then they did some voodoo with the ACA and another $300 billion as well. I want to talk about SNAP for a second. We're in the middle of trying to write a farm bill, and I'm concerned about the politics at play in scoring a piece of legislation that's extremely important to everybody. You know, a farm bill, 85% of a farm bill is SNAP payments, nutritional programs. The largest part of the farm bill also has the highest fraud rate and the error rate. There's been an annual overpayment rate of 10%. Stopping the error rates, stopping the fraud, stopping the overpayments will result in nearly $100 billion in savings to the SNAP program over the next 10 years. So if we get rid of the fraud and abuse and errors, it would save $100 billion over 10 years. Do you believe that fixing the error rate in SNAP would be a cut to the program?
In some sense, it would make sure that the beneficiaries who are supposed to get the benefits are getting them and not other people.
Okay. The bipartisan farm bill that's passed out of the House Ag Committee has a provision in the nutrition title which preserves SNAP benefits and ensures that benefits can modestly increase with the cost of living. Now, my friends across the aisle in the Senate are calling these provisions the largest cut to SNAP in history. In your opinion, do you consider this a cut?
After we saw what the administration did with the changes to the Thrifty Food Plan, we then had to assume that in the future, there could be such large increases again. And I said before that was about $200 to $250 billion of additional costs. And so that gets built into the baseline. What the House has done is scale that back. And so there's a sense in which they're preventing a future administration from doing the kind of increase that was done.
But net, at the end of the day, we're going to be spending more money on SNAP in the future than we are today.
That's correct.
Yeah. Thank you. I yield back.
Thank you again for your courtesy, Senator Marshall, and thank you, Senator Lujan, for your courtesy to your colleague. You are recognized.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. Director, the Radiation Exposure Compensation Act. This program was created to provide compensation and justice to those Americans who suffered devastating health impacts of nuclear weapon development and testing. Despite being created 34 years ago, people in states like New Mexico, which is where the first nuclear bomb was tested, without warning to people in these communities, were left out of the program. Even the author of this legislation, may he rest in peace, the former senator from Utah, Orrin Hatch, he referenced this before he passed away about mistakes that were made in this legislation and how New Mexico is one of those mistakes not being included, not including post-1971 workers, which are uranium mine workers that worked in the mines after 1971, side by side with people that qualify for the program, doing the same jobs. These Americans, many of whom were the unwilling and unknowing victims of radiation exposure, have waited too long for justice. The Senate has now passed my bill to strengthen RECA with Senator Crapo and Senator Hawley twice, but we have yet to get a full analysis of the impact of the program. Meanwhile, the House has refused to act. As a result, the clock ticks on and Americans continue to wait. Those from New Mexico to Utah to Idaho and many other states have fought cancer. Too many have died, and even watched family die alone, being ignored, all without recognition from the government that made them sick. Now, Dr. Swagel, as you work to get that full score, I would like you or your analysts, and preferably all of us, to get together in a room to meet with me and my staff and walk me through the state-by-state breakdown of who would benefit from this improved RECA program. Will you commit to securing that meeting?
Yes, sir. It's because of the path that the legislation took to the Senate floor. As you said, you didn't get a full cost estimate from CBO. We've given some rough guidance on the cost, but you have my commitment that we'll come to you and take you through the estimate. You know, a challenge for us is the state-by-state part, just because we're set up to do federal costs. And so instead of just analyzing one state at a time is a challenge, but we will come and do as much as we can to make sure you get the information you need.
Have you done state-by-state analysis before?
You know, not of the RECA program. We have of some programs, but not of this one.
Dr. Swagel, have you conducted analysis for Wyoming,
I'm sorry, say again?
the state of Wyoming, as it pertains to RECA?
Oh, no, we haven't.
Yes, the CBO has. And have you done it for New Mexico?
Not separately.
So I've been told, because the mistake that was made by CBO with the initial scoring, I wasn't planning on getting into this, but if there's going to be something included in the record as to what the capabilities are or are not, Wyoming and New Mexico had to be reviewed because there was a mistake of including analysis of Wyoming when Wyoming was not included in the original bill and New Mexico was. And so CBO had to look at that initially, from its initial score to where we are. The score the CBO came out with the initial draft was $160 billion, $150 billion. This program was started back in 1990. It's cost us a lot of money, $2.2 billion. It's hard for me to understand without seeing disaggregated data how the program grows exponentially from 2.2 over a 30-year period to 75% higher. So I think it's important for us to get there. I think the other offices would also be very interested in presenting the facts to the Congress, to my colleagues, to the American people about what this is and what this is not. I very much appreciate what the ranking member shared about Tip O'Neill and President Reagan. That was a time when people in this town could still stipulate the facts. And then they would negotiate, but they could stipulate to facts what the receipts were. And I just want to make sure that we have the correct receipts in this place so that we can have an honest conversation about the policy and get help to a whole bunch of people across America who this country owes a liability to, owes an apology to, and quite honestly, cost them their lives in many instances and the cancer that they're still going through today. So I very much look forward to that. And Mr. Chairman, I have other questions. I'm going to submit them into the record to be respectful of my colleagues today as well, but very much appreciate the agreement to be able to secure a meeting and have a thorough conversation about this package, this legislation for myself, and there may be other offices that want to be included. So thank you.
Thanks, Senator Lujan, and if we can help facilitate that meeting, don't hesitate to ask. Senator Braun.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you for having the discussion on budget here today. Dr. Swagel, you and I have had many conversations since I've been here 5.5 years ago, and I look at your basic one-pager here, and some things stand out to me, and that is how stubborn revenue generation has been. You compile statistics that show that revenues from 94 to 23 have averaged 17.2% of GDP, correct?
That's right.
And actually, at 23 and 24, 23 was lower, 24 is going to be slightly higher. But when you look at the stubbornness of that figure and the fact in even your own projections, you see it staying flat generally around 18%. Is that what you've got here in terms of basing long-term forecasts on?
No, that's right. And the 23 was lower because there was some revenue that got pushed from 23 into 24, the disaster declarations, especially in California, for example. The corporate minimum tax wasn't implemented. So that's why 23 was a bit lower. But as you said...
But it's been a stubborn range of between 17.5 and 18.5.
That's right.
And most of the 18.5 is projections into the future. So I want to then go to outlays. And for nearly 30 years, those were averaging around 21% of GDP. And those culminated in recent years in the $1 trillion structural deficits. Is that correct, give or take?
That's right, especially
Yes.
on the mandatory side.
And now that has doubled to about $2 trillion, give or take, in the present.
That's right.
So it gets bleaker as you make projections into the future. And revenue has been stubbornly consistent regardless of tax rate. Is that correct?
That's right. And, there have been legislative changes as revenues have gone up that have taken them back down. So there is some
But generally,
legislation
that
there.
would mean once you cut taxes, you're depriving the Treasury in the short run. You might get a little better economic growth generally as you go into years 2, 3, and 4. And the reverse is true, when you raise taxes, correct?
That's right.
You're going to flush a little more into the Treasury, and then economic growth is going to go down a little bit each year.
Yep.
The fundamentals that basically drive our economy and our government generally.
No, that's essentially what we've got in our projections
So-
as well.
When you've got here, looking at 2024, the snapshot of where we are currently, and you see that revenue is budging at most 1 point as a percentage of GDP, and you're taking spending up by 4 additional percentage points. Correct? From 23, which is 23.1, to 27.3.
I'm sorry, I just want to make sure 23.1.
In 24 is what you're forecasting, will be up on the outlay line.
20, I'm sorry, I wonder, if you, I'm sorry, since I'm the one.
I'm
who's
talking
reading
about
the sheet.
outlays.
Yeah.
Outlays
are going
on
from
the chart you
24.2
gave me.
Yep, 24.2
Yeah.
in 2024.
And then what are you showing in 2054?
I'm sorry, I gave you, so I gave you our long-term outlook.
Yes.
And I have our short-term outlook. in
Well,
front of me.
okay, so, but they're
That's why.
close.
But you've got the numbers right.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So, in your opinion, how do we get things right-sized? Can we do it through revenue when history has shown we've never been able to? And the cutting taxes started back many, many years ago without adjusting spending. And to me, it looks like the data is all there, that if we don't want to keep borrowing from our kids and grandkids, that we've got to choose and prioritize what we're spending here that's going to match up with what revenues have shown that we can generate over a long period of time. Do you agree with that?
Right. I mean, that is the choice in front of policymakers, that the
Okay.
revenues and outlays at some point have to come closer together. That can be done, as you said, on the outlay side. In principle, it could be done on the revenue side if, it's up to the Congress. You could have higher rates. You could
And
have
you
a
always
broader
say that
base.
because yours is not to advise on policy, it's just to tell us the figures.
The figures, that's right.
And the figures are bleak.
It is a daunting situation with
Okay,
rising
we'll
debt.
settle for daunting. And then I want to circle back to what the chair said earlier. Shocks to our economy, which we had to navigate through in 08, 09. That was trivial dollar-wise compared to what we spent recently on COVID. You maybe can't measure the two, but that was roughly measured around $1 trillion. What we did was over $4 trillion, and then enterprised over the last couple years, or first 2 years of the Biden administration, to add another roughly $3 trillion. So we're in a place where this, to me, looks like we end up with something like a Chapter 11 in the real world, which means sooner or later you've got to get our spending in line with our revenue. I mentioned that coming in to this hearing. A lady working here in the Capitol carrying a box of files laughed out loud when I said that, and it was in agreement. And I think that's what the American public is doing. One final thing, because don't see anybody else here, so I'd like to have a little latitude since I
for it.
spent so much time on it. Healthcare is the place that we can, within our own means, take a broken industry and system that has no consumer involvement within it, no emphasis on prevention and wellness, and it's run by a very corporate system of healthcare that's even frustrating doctors and nurses to become a part of it, and that is doable. And unless we want government to even do more, I would ask that the healthcare industry embraces things like competition, transparency, engages every American in their own well-being so that you don't need to use the system as much, because it is approaching 20% of our GDP. And in most other developed countries, it's 10 to 13%. Would your opinion be that that would be the lowest hanging fruit of where, if we put policies into place that can actually weigh in on our current chronic big deficit?
Yeah, I'm going to switch metaphors. It's where the dollars are. It's the rising spending, and you could see that in the chairman's chart at the beginning, that healthcare spending is rising quickly. The good and the bad is that there's so many distortions in healthcare, as you said. It's hard to get at them, but there's so many dollars that even if you make kind of modest progress in percentage terms, the dollar change can be quite large.
So thanks for the latitude on time. Thanks for your answers. In summary, we've got to spend less than we take in. History shows that revenue is stubborn. History also shows that we used to have healthcare as a percentage of our GDP closer to 10%, not too many decades ago. And the rest of the world has figured out how to do that at better value. We need to start doing a few things that most Americans believe should be done. Don't spend more than you take in. And if something's out of line in terms of cost, reform it. Thank you for being here today. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you very much, Senator Braun. I believe we're waiting one more colleague, so I'll take just an additional moment while we give him a chance to walk from his other hearing to this one, and point out that, at least in our view, the net effect of the 2008 mortgage meltdown and the recession that followed ran around $5 trillion, and that the bulk of the effect was not spending, but was lost revenue because of the shock to the economy. People simply weren't paying taxes because they weren't making money because the economy collapsed. Is that a pretty fair overview of how the 2008 mortgage meltdown hit the economy? Am I roughly in the right neighborhood with those numbers?
Yeah, that's right. It had a big negative impact on activity, and then from there to revenue. And there was a legislative response, the TARP. A lot of that money came back as the assets that were purchased by the Treasury were sold back to the private sector.
Yeah. And while, as you pointed out in your exchange with Senator Braun, the growth in healthcare spending has been one of the primary drivers on the spending side, we do have the comparison with CBO's 2008 projections for where that spending would be and where it actually went. And it's $6.3 trillion lower than projected over that intervening time period. So while that number has gone, nope, other one, it's not here, never mind. So while that healthcare spending number has gone up, something happened to keep it from going way more up. And thank you, Doctor, for your work trying to parse through the data to figure out exactly what it was that helped us save those $6.3 trillion without cutting benefits. Because if we can do more of that, that would be a very, very good thing. Senator Van Hollen, are you ready to roll?
Oh,
Great. You're up then, followed by Senator Kennedy.
all right. Well, thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you, Director Swagel. It's good to see you again. Let me just start on the revenue side, because I'm looking at the CBO projections, and I see that, a number of months ago, you had projected that the Trump tax cuts would add, well, this is back during that time, $4.6 trillion to the debt over the next 10 years. I understand you had an earlier exchange with the chairman. The Trump tax cuts did not pay for themselves despite claims, right? Yes.
That's correct. That's what we
And your projection is that if we just did a straight extension of the tax cuts, those would not pay for themselves either, would they?
No, they wouldn't.
So one of the arguments that was made at the time was that the trickle-down economics was going to work, right? I'm looking at the projections that were made by the Trump economic team. They predicted that that tax plan would generate 4 to 6% growth in GDP. But then I'm looking at the 7 quarters that succeeded that, and so this is data before the COVID pandemic hit. And I'm seeing that growth actually during that period of time was not appreciably different than the growth during the prior 7 quarters. There was a small bump in Q2 of 2018 to 3.5%, but that was the same as Q4 of 2017 before enactment of the Trump tax. So this whole theory of trickle-down economics was behind the claims that the tax cuts were going to pay for themselves, right?
That would be the way that, in principle, a tax cut could pay for itself if it generates so much additional output that comes back as revenue. And the analysis CBO did in 2018 was that there would be some impact. There'd be some impact on business investment, and then some additional revenue. It was about an 18% fiscal feedback. So so something. And the challenge was that, as you said, we saw a little bit of a higher growth early in 2018, and then in the middle of 2018. Tariffs were raised, and those look to have affected business investment. And so, in some sense, even before the pandemic, if there were macro effects of the tax cut, those got in some sense, offset or hidden by the by trade policy.
And I looked at the CBO analysis, and I saw some of the feedback loop, and I think you attribute those primarily to some of the corporate tax cuts. But let me ask you on the individual side, the claims that big personal tax cuts for wealthy people was going to generate something like in the range of 4.6%. I mean, that was just ridiculous, right?
The CBO didn't have those kind of figures.
You're being diplomatic, but and of course, claims going forward that continuing that Trump tax cuts would pay for themselves, as you said, is absurd. I will point out that if you look at the analyses that were done by the Tax Policy Center, they point out that extending the Trump tax cuts would provide more than twice the benefit for the top 1% than for the bottom 60% as a percentage of their income. In real dollars, that translates to an average $48,000 tax cut for households in the top 1%, about $500 for those in the bottom 60%. So it makes no sense to add even more to our deficits to disproportionately benefit those at the very top. I will point out that President Biden has committed to making sure that any tax benefits that apply to people $400,000 and under will be maintained. But it does seem a total, a stupid and backwards policy to extend those that provided big breaks to the wealthy that did not have the so-called trickle-down growth benefit, but did add to the deficit. In my remaining time, I'd just like to ask you about the recent cuts to the IRS. As you know, as part of the budget deal last year, there was a $20 billion clawback. What is your best estimate of how much that will add to the deficit over time?
So our calculations are that $1 of additional resources to the IRS generates about $2 of revenue, so a net of 1. So the rescission of funding to the IRS, that's why it increased the deficit in our projections.
Right.
So roughly, 2 to 1.
So it was $20 billion cuts. So your estimate is that what it will lose $40 billion.
About $40 billion in revenue.
Yeah. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Senator Van Hollen. Senator Kennedy of the great state of Louisiana.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Director, welcome. Mr. Director, what's the national debt right now?
Well, it's we project at the end of this year it's going to be over $28.1 trillion.
28 trillion. What percentage of GDP is that?
It's just under 100%.
Could you speak into the mic and
Yep,
repeat that?
it's just under 100% of GDP.
Okay. And for this current fiscal year, will we have spending deficits?
Yes, sir. We're looking at about a $2 trillion deficit this year.
And that means that we've spent $2 trillion more than we took in, right?
That's right.
So we've had to borrow money.
That's right. That's right. The debt is going up.
And so that money that we borrowed increases the amount of national debt, doesn't it?
That's right. And it means more interest payments, which then goes back and means more debt. So there's a negative cycle attached to it.
Okay. So our current national debt is over 100% of our economy. It's $28 trillion. Let's suppose that we think in 10-year windows, as you know. Let's suppose nothing changes over the next 10 years. Nothing. We don't renew the tax cuts. Nothing changes. What's the debt going to be 10 years from now?
Right. So our projection is then over $50 trillion or over 122% of GDP.
Yeah. Well, damn, looks to me like we better do something. I mean, we can sit here and debate the tax cuts and you talk about the tax cuts don't work. I don't know how you know that because the pandemic skewed all economic results. But we better do something, huh? Do you think we can sustain the spending?
No, the risks are mounting with higher interest payments and higher debt. And that's, as you said, that's why action must be taken.
So what should we do?
It's, the sooner Congress acts, the easier it will be.
I get that.
It's not
So
going to be
what
easier.
should we do?
I'm here to support you, but not to tell
Support
you
me. What
not to
should
tell
we
you what
do?
to do. I mean, reduce the deficit. You have choices. You can look at mandatory spending on the spending side as a driver. You have healthcare costs and Social Security. On the revenue side.
Well, let me stop
Yep.
you for a second. Yeah, everybody always says that mandatory spending is driving the cost, but and they say, well, look, we've got to do something because the Social Security trust fund is going to run out, and Social Security is going to be automatically cut. Look me in the eye and tell me you really think the United States Congress is going to allow Social Security to be cut.
I would expect some action to be taken before that happens.
So if you think the United States Congress is going to sit here and allow Social Security to be cut, even if there's not a penny left in the trust fund, you've been dipping into your ketamine supply. It is not going to happen. We'll just go into the general fund and take the money, won't we?
Right, and that would add to the deficit under
Yeah.
as compared to current law.
So why do we, I get it. We make these distinctions between mandatory spending and discretionary spending, but it's really out of the same pot.
That's right. There's just one general fund of the Treasury.
Okay, so one option is to reduce our spending, correct?
That's right.
What if we cut our spending 1%? 1%. What if we turned to every single department head in the federal government and said, next year you're going to cut your spending 1%. Not 5%, not 4%, 1%. Something families who are living under Bidenomics, which is defined as paying more to live worse, something families have to do every day. What would be the impact of a 1% cut by every budget officer?
Yeah. So outlays next year are going to be just under $7 trillion. So 1% of that is $70 billion.
What we did 2%? What would be
140.
the impact?
Yep, there'd be $140 billion. And that's the challenge, is that the deficit is so large that, that what you're saying, makes a difference, but is pretty modest relative to the size of the challenge.
What do you think we would have to cut spending to get in control of our debt?
Yeah. So if you just wanted to stabilize the debt, make it so that the debt's at 100%,
Yes.
it goes up not by too much.
Yeah.
You'd have to cut and do it on the spending side. You're talking about $5 trillion over 10 years.
What percentage is that?
Right. So that's, over 10 years. So spending, spending is $7 trillion, multiply that by 10, so it's about $70 trillion, a bit more.
Give me a percentage. American
Yeah,
people think in terms of percentage.
No, that's right. So say you're talking about a roughly 7 to 8% reduction in spending. Overall, just to stabilize the debt. We'd still have a high debt.
And then we
but it
could
would
try to
stabilize.
grow out of it.
Yeah, positive growth would improve revenues and help the situation.
I'm way over. I'm sorry, Mr. Chairman. I enjoyed talking to you, Mr. Director.
Very good. Thank
Thanks,
you.
Senator Kennedy. Senator Johnson.
Mr. Chairman, sorry I was absent until this point in time. I just have a very specific line of question here, Director Swagel. Your projections assume, obviously, the tax cuts expire, correct?
That's correct.
I think one of the real tragedies of that occurring is we're going to have an enormous disparity between C corporations, which represent about 5% of American businesses, and all the other pass-throughs. What I want to know, in your projections, because having been a pass-through business myself, actually I've been part of a business of every different type of corporate structure. And quite honestly, during the tax reform of 2017, 2018, I got letters from the AICPA saying this is exactly what would happen, is that particularly large pass-through businesses, but this might happen with small pass-through businesses as well, they're not going to be able to compete with that huge disparity between C corps and pass-throughs. So a lot of them will convert, particularly the big ones will convert to C corp status, which is going to be a much larger, not only marginal, but effective tax rate. In your projections going out, do you take that in consideration?
It's an issue we've been struggling with because we've modeled current law, our projections are current law, and we've been trying to think exactly about this. If you're an S corp, there's uncertainty about what's going to happen at the end of 25. To what extent will S corps make the switch, now in advance of the, the expiration? So we have a little bit of that switching in our revenue modeling, but not the kind of full-fledged switching that you'd expect, say, in early 26.
I mean, would you agree with me? I mean, the rational choice for a business person, if you want to continue to compete, because let's face it, pass-throughs compete with the corporations at the entity level. Now, I know everything about double taxation, that type of thing, but I think it's about 2/3 of C corp business income is never taxed, correct? Are you aware of that figure?
I don't know offhand, but there's lots of income that's retained.
But a large, well, it's retained, but also a lot of C corps are owned by non-taxable, tax-exempt.
That's right.
So again, it's hard to get that figure, but somewhere between 2/3 and 3/4 of C corp income is never double taxed. So you're looking at an effective rate, we got it from JCT, of 10% for large corporations, 14% for small C corps. And large pass-throughs are going to be up over 40%, aren't they?
No, that's right, because the lower corporate rate from the 2017 Act is permanent.
So a large pass-through is going to be paying a top marginal tax rate over 40%, competing against, whether there's a large or small C corp, somewhere with an effective tax rate of 10 to 14%. So the rational thing for a pass-through would be, I can't compete, I'm going to convert to a C corp status.
Yes, no, that's exactly right. And we've been trying to figure out when that, sort of that massive switch will happen, given the uncertainty about what's going to happen next year.
So one of the reasons I'm bringing this up is I'm trying to get a score on what I'm proposing, which would be to equalize the tax treatment between American businesses. In other words, tax all business income at the ownership level. That's what pass-throughs do. Trying to get that score is going to be difficult for me because we're not really reflecting what's actually going to happen if we let those tax cuts expire. So is there any way I can get some sense of what that number is going to be if there's a massive shift, which I believe there would be, from large pass-throughs, particular switching to C corps?
Okay, I'll tell you two things. So one is the formal estimate would come from JCT, just because that'd be a change in the tax code. We have an excellent tax analysis division, and we could come talk to you about how our revenue projections would change. It wouldn't be, the cost estimate that JCT would do, but we could talk you through how we would see it and what it would mean for revenue.
Okay, well, let's start with how you have accounted for that, because you've been thinking it through. You've made some provision for it.
Yep.
Let's take a look at that, and then what kind of work with me on that. I'd appreciate it.
Okay.
That's all I have, Mr. Chairman. Thank you.
Thanks very much. To Two things I'll close with as we wrap up the hearing. One is that we've referred several times to the risk that the economy faces from climate shocks. The chief economist of Freddie Mac broke that out into weather, storms, sea level rise, make insurance harder and harder to predict, which makes insurance first more expensive and then unavailable. And once the insurance becomes unavailable, then you can't get a mortgage because mortgage holders require insurance on the property. And once you can't get a mortgage on a property, your pool of buyers shrinks dramatically to those who've got the money to simply pay cash. So supply-demand drives prices down. It's not that complicated. No insurance, no mortgage, no buyers, no good market. So the prospect of that creating a shock to the economy along the lines of the 2008 shock or worse have been repeatedly raised in this committee. And I would just note today, the New York Times has an article about how climate change is blowing up property insurance markets. And it's not only happening in high-risk states like Florida, but the companies are actually raising rates in other areas to try to counterbalance for the risk that they're having to assume in these either wildfire-adjacent or coastal-adjacent markets that are getting increasingly hard to predict. And the last word on this came from the expert who spoke to the New York Times, and he said, "I personally think we're in a lot of trouble. This should be ringing alarm bells for housing markets all over the country." We have tried to ring those alarm bells here in the Budget Committee before this blows up in our faces because of the role of the fossil fuel industry in fomenting all of this through its pollution and through its political mischief. We have a very hard time finding any bipartisanship on that, but the facts ought to be pretty obvious by now. So I would make that point because that came up today. And then I'd close with this graphic, which shows the increase in non-defense discretionary spending, which is my Republican friends' traditional spending target, from 2019 to 2024 as a percentage of GDP. So you move from a little over 3% of GDP to about 3.35% of GDP. So it's an increase of 7% from here to here. As you can see, it's visually a relatively small increase. And then when you dive into what that increase is made up of, 40% of it is made up of benefits for veterans. The PACT Act and things where we made things better for veterans. Do they really want to get rid of that? I kind of doubt it. Health expenditure up 18%. Well, we have ways to get after that by improving the reimbursement system and doing more of what reduced the expense by $6.3 trillion against 2008 projections. Community development disaster relief. Now, most of that is FEMA. Do we really want to starve FEMA while we're having unprecedented levels of climate-driven catastrophes that require FEMA to come to people's rescue? I kind of doubt it. Ukraine and international spending, 12% that's 12% of the 7%, by the way. It's not that big of a number, but it's 12%. Do we really want to leave Ukraine high and dry to the tender mercies of the pediatric hospital bombing monster Putin? I kind of doubt it. And then there are the income security pieces down here, again, 12%. So when people are talking about making very significant cuts to non-discretionary spending, they are talking about digging into very basic programs and services for the American people, and we should be aware of that. We have a significant revenue problem. We have a very significant healthcare inefficiency problem, and we have a very significant climate risk problem. And if we can address those three problems, I think we'll be well on our way to solving the concerns that you have brought to our attention today, Dr. Swagel. So with that, I will conclude the hearing. If there are Any further questions for the doctor that come in as, there's some questions Senator Lujan said he had. If there are any others, get them in by noon tomorrow, colleagues, staff. And we will ask Director Swagel to respond to those questions within 7 days of his receipt of them. If you could do that, Dr. Swagel?
We will do that, yes.
That would be great. With no further business before the committee, the hearing is adjourned.
Great.